right, so we've looked a lot in recent weeks, primarily in the Wednesday nights, into the heresy of John Calvin. And so I thought it would be a good idea to look at the alternate side of things, the alternate side of theology. And so I've got two names up there on the board for you, Pelagius and Jacobus Armenius. Now, I'm not going to keep calling him Jacobus. You know, they Latinized his name just like they did Pelagius. But Jacob Arminius is the exact opposite of Calvin. And Pelagius, likewise, would be the opposite of Calvin and Calvinism. And if you hear these names, most often you hear them being brought up by Calvinists and talking about them as being heretics. Good morning, brother. Good to see you.
Good morning.
You know, so I thought this morning, where we had looked a lot at John Calvin, and assuming that you've heard these names and heard some things about these two men, we would look at, and it'll take 2 weeks to go through them. We'll pretty much cover Pelagius this morning and just get into Jacob Arminius on that. Now, both of these men believe in man's free will to accept or to reject salvation by grace through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so again, this is why both of these men are looked at as heretics by the Roman Catholic Church and by all those who have accepted and adopted Calvinism. So what I want to look at is the known facts about these two men and their influence on Christianity, on Christian theology, so we can better understand, again, our own history. And, you know, what we want to look at here and see and come to understand is that everything that we believe, everything we practice, everything we hold to doctrinally, okay, has been around since the 1st century AD. So we're going to begin with Pelagius. He lived from 354 to 418 AD. Now, he was believed to have been either Irish or Welsh. There's some conjecture there, but the early years of his ministry, he was in Britain, so most likely he was Welsh or Britain. And his given name, his Britain name or Welsh name would have been Morgan. Okay, Pelagius is a Latinification of his given name. Morgan in Gaelic means seaborn or from the sea. In Greek, that would be Pelagios or Pelagius, as you know, of the sea. Same thing when we get to Jacobus Armenius. His name has been Latinized, and I don't know why. Then the Catholics got a hold of it. So, now, an interesting thing about Pelagius, okay, where we just went through St. Patrick's Day. Pelagius predated Patrick by at least 30 years. Patrick was born in 385 AD, okay, dying in 461 AD. All right, and of course, we've discussed Patrick before when we were discussing the history of the New Testament church, that he was anything but a Roman Catholic, and that they have usurped him and altered and changed who he is as far as in their written histories, but if you read those things that have been written by Patrick, you'll find out that he was very much a Bible-believing, born-again, believing Christian. And this is the same case that we have here with Pelagius. The problem is, everything that we have, for the most part, the vast majority of what's out there written by both of these two men, that is written by his enemies and his detractors. And so you got to be careful, and you got to look at who's saying these things about him. Now, it's believed by some that the Apostle Paul, in between his first imprisonment and his second imprisonment, actually made it to the British Isles. Don't know that that's true or not. But Christianity was certainly very much in existence by the 2nd century AD in the British Isles. There. And so it's no great surprise, to find Pelagius, an active Christian preacher in Britain in the 4th century. No surprise with that at all. Now, Pelagius moves from Britain and goes to Rome in 380 AD. He ends up dying in Roman Egypt in 418 AD. So what is Pelagianism? Now, Pelagius believed in salvation that was by God's grace through faith in the finished work of the Lord Jesus Christ. Pretty straightforward there. Just before his death, 415 AD, the Synod of Diospolis, if I'm pronouncing it right, were basically passing judgment upon Pelagius in regards to his theology. Reading through this, I found the statement where they talk about the communion of the Catholic Church. It's like the flags go up immediately. Okay, so here in the Synod of Diospolis, we have in this official document about this synod, they have this comment here talking about the communion of the Catholic Church, and they're mentioning this in relation to their judgment on Pelagius. Well, of course, the Church of Rome had its beginnings with the Emperor Constantine, about 325 through 350 AD. And we already have them using this terminology of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the first time that word Catholic or Catholic had been used in any kind of Christian writings was Ignatius of Antioch, who used it in I think it was a letter he was writing in about 110 AD. So the next generation after the last of the apostles. Thing is, that term Catholic is not a Bible term. It's not. You're not going to find it anywhere in the scriptures. It comes from Greek philosophy, and it refers to, in Greek philosophy, talking about the general or universal brotherhood of humanity. All right, so we're talking about a philosophical terminology here. It comes from Greek humanism. All right, so that should be the first warning right there. Now, at the time of Pelagius, the Roman Catholic Church is already teaching salvation by works. All right, it's already teaching that you need to be baptized, preferably as a baby, because baby baptism is being practiced at this point of time. That salvation can only be had through the Roman Catholic Church, that you have to partake of the Mass, which is already being seen in its full form here. It is, except for a few things we see the Church of Rome already in its full form going on here. And all of Pelagius' enemies are all Roman Catholics. So there again, something tells me here, that okay, if they are condemning Pelagius, I need to take a more careful look at what this guy has to say. Okay, it was them who declared him and what he believed to be, what he was teaching as heresy. When heretics call somebody else a heretic, the chances are they aren't. Okay, again, he believed in the free will of man, and this is important. Remembering this as we go on to when we get to Jacobus Armenius, because that was one of the things that was declared by his enemies about him, is that he believed in Pelagianism. Which is, again, the free will of man, man's free will to make a choice in things. Pelagius knew and taught that God did not create man as being evil, but that man inherited a sinful nature from Adam, who had chosen by his free will to sin. Let's see again. We'll get to this in a minute here with Augustine, and we'll see what's going on there. He fully understood, Pelagius did, that men needed to make an individual conscious choice to accept or reject the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ. This was the theology that he taught. He rejected infant baptism, and so he's lined himself up here against the core doctrines of the Church of Rome. Now Augustine, his contemporary. If you remember me teaching about Augustine, we were teaching the history of the New Testament church. What a monster this guy is. See, Augustine in Catholic teaching is the one who is credited with solidifying the doctrine of Adam's fall in the garden and then passing it on to all mankind, original sin. They're saying that doctrine wasn't solidified until Augustine. Well, baloney. People have known that, including Adam himself from the time that Adam fell. And that's, of course, what Pelagius had been teaching, that men weren't sinners because God created them as being sinful, but that men are sinners because they inherited a sin nature from their father Adam. They're not the children of God, they're the children of Adam. And so Augustine is angry because he doesn't want Pelagius to steal his thunder here. He's angry that Pelagius had not already been condemned and been excommunicated. So now he calls another council, the Council of Carthage in 418. And it's at this council, Augustine makes 9 statements of belief of the Roman Catholic Church that Pelagius denied. And I want to read through those 9 because they're very interesting. The first one is, he states that death came from sin and not man's physical mortal nature. That people die because they're sinners. We die physically, mortally, and that's what he was referring to, because of the curse of sin, but not because of anything we do in sin, but because that's the condition that we're now in. The second statement is infants must be baptized to cleanse them of original sin. Well, you're not going to find that anywhere in here, okay? Again, this is Augustine. Now, the next three are roots of Calvinism. And this is important, because like I say, what we want to get to here eventually, and it'll be next week, is getting to Jacobus Armenius, is because he was going directly head to head with John Calvin. Okay, number 3, justifying grace covers our past sins only. But justifying grace can help you to avoid future ones. Well, no, Christ died for all men's sins, and he died for all sin. Okay, so in other words, again, when we get to that tulip theory, that perseverance of the saints, that you can lose your salvation if you don't persevere, so that's wrong. God's grace, number 4, enables you to will and to act on God's commandments. In other words, you don't have the will to respond in a positive manner to God's grace. Well, I mean, that's Calvinism right there. Okay, but this is coming out of the mouth of Augustine. Number 5, no good works can be done without God's grace. So you can't do anything that's good without the grace of God. Okay, well, Titus 3:5 says, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy he saved us by. Okay, you can do good works, you can do right, you know, but he says that, so unless you are, you know, baptized as a baby, you know, confirmed to the Church of Rome and take the Mass and all that, then you can't have God's grace. And if you don't have God's grace, then you can't do anything good anyways. I mean, that is absolute Calvinism right there. But now we're talking about this, you know, over 1,000 years, you know, 1,100 years before John Calvin. It says, we confess that we are sinners because it is true and not out of humility. Well, until a person comes to a point of humility and contriteness, they're not going to admit to the fact that they're a sinner as God sees sinners.
People don't like to be called sinners.
Right, because they will, without coming to that point of understanding and knowledge, you're not going to get saved.
Now, is that where they use the word self-righteousness?
Yes. You know, but here, again, he's saying that, well, we confess we're sinners because it's a fact. Well, yeah, it's a fact, but I mean, come on, you've all tried to tell people about Christ. You've all tried to win people to Christ. You've been so, I mean, you know, so, see, and here's where he's going with it. Statement number 7 and 8. The saints, okay, and again, we're talking about the Roman Catholic definition of saints here, ask forgiveness for their own sins. And then statement 8 is that these same saints also confess to be sinners because they are. Doesn't sound anything. But here's the thing. Okay, the Roman Catholic Church today states that once somebody is elevated to sainthood, okay, they cease being seen as sinners. In fact, they say, well, they were saints, therefore they never were sinners. So you see you've got this conflict going on here to how the Church of Rome is always changing what it's saying and changing. Okay, and it's saying here, well, the saints, okay, and again, at this point, they're saying not everybody's a saint. Okay, the saints also confess to be sinners because they are. Well, you know, whoever it is that you're sitting here trying to say is a saint is confessing that they're a sinner. Well, yeah, because they know they're a sinner saved by grace. You know, it's double speak is what they're doing here. And then the 9th statement is infants dying without baptism are damned. Okay, those are the 9 statements that Augustine makes, that he says that Pelagius is denying. and so therefore he's a heretic and needs to be condemned and excommunicated. And, well, he ends up being excommunicated, and he's allowed to go live in Egypt, where he dies. But I mean, you can see the problem that we have here. When you research Pelagius, almost every source that you search in a public search on Pelagius is going to have the Roman Catholic slant to what it tells you about him. Almost everything that's available, that's out there in writing, that's written about Pelagius was written by his enemies. And so we've got to be very careful about any conclusions that we make about Pelagius. Now, based on what Augustine writes about Pelagius, Pelagius to me sounds like he's a good Bible-believing Christian. You know? And that's why he gets condemned, is because he's standing against the teachings of Rome. Now, one of the other very interesting things that we see that comes out from this is we are already seeing here in the 5th century the foundations of Calvinism within the teachings of the Church of Rome. Well, guess who else condemns Pelagius? Calvinist Protestantism. Gotta be careful, because a lot of this stuff, just as, you know, they never fully came out of Rome, most of them. And particularly those of them who decided, like the Dutch Reformed Church, to adopt the teachings of the Frenchman John Calvin. And so in enters Jacobus Armenius, okay, which again, name has been Latinized by guess who? Roman Catholic Church. Now he was born Jacob Hermansoon, and he was born in Oudwater of the Netherlands on August 10th of 1560, and he dies in Leiden in the Netherlands in October 19th of 1609. So he is a contemporary of John Calvin. Calvin's tulip doctrine was put together by his followers as a direct opposition to what Jacob Arminius was teaching theologically. So we'll touch a little bit, just to begin with, on the history of him before we really get deeply into the theology of what he taught. You know, the thing is, pretty much all your major theological schools and seminaries since the 1950s have been, I'm trying to find the right word to use here, their staff, their teachers, have all been 5-point Calvinists. Yeah. And we'll touch on that a little bit on this morning's message, about a statement that got made this week that I had to say really wound me up. And so the vast majority of your pastors, evangelists, missionaries that have gone to these schools have been being taught Calvinism, and have been being taught that Jacob Arminius, was a heretic. And of course, one of the things that they said, well, Jacob Arminius was, followed the teachings of Pelagius. He believed in Pelagianism, okay, which of course was condemned by the Church of Rome and condemned by Calvinist Protestantism. Well, anything that's condemned by the Church of Rome, you better look twice at it. Okay, because that's the Church of Satan. Now, his father died, Jacob's father died when he was very young, as a child. And not long after that, his mother was murdered by Roman Catholic Spaniards during the siege of Oatwater. This occurred during, there was a war of rebellion in the Netherlands against against Spain. Spain controlled the Netherlands at this time, and of course Spain, Roman Catholic, and of course you've had the Reformation going on as well. And so there's what was called the 80 Years' War, where the Netherlands fought for their independence. And out of the fact of the Reformation going on at the same time, that became part of it, reformers fighting against Roman Catholics. And so somewhere during that siege, which was almost a month long there, she was murdered by the Spaniards, and so he ends up being orphaned. His first contact with Protestant doctrine, being taught Protestant doctrine, was in 1572, and it was from a former Roman Catholic priest who was now following Protestantism by the name of Theodorus Emilius. He went on to be educated at the University at Leiden, and he also spent time in Geneva with Calvin. And so he ended up being exposed to both sides of things, but when he returned to Leiden in the Netherlands, he was pretty much a Calvinist. He was a member, and he was ordained into the Dutch Reformed Church, and that was in 1588 in Amsterdam. And the very first thing they tasked him with, his superiors, was to write a paper to refute those who were opposed to Calvinism. So he dug into this and started. The problem is he started really studying the subject in comparison to what the scriptures were saying. He found himself being in agreement with those who were opposing Calvinism, and he became an outspoken promoter of, or detractor, I guess to be of Calvinism, promoting the free will of man, and the fact that God's grace is extended to all, and that Christ died for the sins of all men, that there was not just a chosen elect, and that God had arbitrarily chosen some for heaven and some for hell. He began teaching against this subject, and of course now this brings him into immediate head-to-head confrontation with not only the Dutch Reformed Church, but a great many of the Protestant churches at the time who had adopted Calvinism. That's why you find so many of your Protestant churches persecuting Baptists, why you find them persecuting Waldenses and Moravians and Huguenots and Puritans, and so because they did not follow the teachings of John Calvin, but they followed what the Bible clearly teaches, is that salvation is available to all men. It's up to them to make a choice, their free will. Christ died for the sins of all men. All men have salvation by grace through faith available to them. They have to make a choice on that. And we're going to stop there with that today. because next week I want to get into, again, we went through the tulip theory there for, a couple of weeks on Wednesday nights, went through it once again, teaching on that, and refuting it very soundly, very clearly, very methodically, with the scriptures, and the wrongness of it. And again, the whole reason this whole tulip thing came about, after John Calvin died, Arminius is still alive, Calvin's followers, to try to fight against him, refute him,